Hello and most welcome to 946 of the series, and I will continue likely now with a little bit more about Susie Vrobel, of course, and I will mention something that is a bit similar, and it's something I read from an English mathematician called Stephen Wolfram. He is a very interesting paradigm shifter, as he calls himself. Bye, bye, take it easy, have a safe ride. And we will try to understand simple system, and what he discovered was that simple systems do produce results that are completely random, and that this very randomness, until the exponential modern power of computation, was completely unknown. We had no idea about it. But now we know even simple arithmetic and logarithmical structures will produce completely unexpected results. And this, of course, put a shock into the mathematical sphere. It was not something that we had expected from previous thinking. There was still a lingering hope of having mathematics sort of understandable from only one point. The project of Gödel that got catastrophized in 1931 completely with a publication with Gödel's theorem of computability. It is disastrous for what we used to have, and of course this gives also the reason to understand that mathematics doesn't repeat itself. It is very similar to, if you think of the pi, for instance, that there is no regularity inborn in pi, and it continues to be irregular to the very end, and the end is never coming. This is how these things works. They are non-repetitive patterns, and they are very similar to what you find in fractality. Iteration is a sort of repetition, but it's not complete sameness. There is always a sort of an inborn predisposed difference to it. And in this inborn predisposed difference, we don't have complete repetition. It is constantly a difference going on, and in this difference we see that history does not repeat itself. It is never ever the same, not even in the simplest of things like mathematics. And of course this came as a shock, and I was thinking, why did no one think about this before? Why did we always assume that complications do only come, complexity can only come from very complex things? Stephen Wolfram, in a YouTube clip I just listened to, I haven't been able to read his book yet, he mentions that this greater computability had made it possible. And there is a second thing. Physics and mathematics naturally go in areas where they know they can control the situation. And why enter too much into areas where you don't control, like pi? That will just upset the results more and more. So there are some natural reasons for this regularity to occur on a very frequent basis. And it gives a false pretense that mathematics in itself do always predict correctly its own outcome. It cannot be within the system. I need to put a pause. Well, let's continue with Susie Vrobel, and I now come to the point of chapter 6. Temporal binding, synchronizing perceptions. It starts very literally. The smell of an overripe papaya at my local supermarket recently brought me back to the memory of a trip through the Central American jungle. Immediately the entire activation pattern was firing again in my brain. I reheard the sounds of the howler monkeys, felt the sticky surface of moist plants on my skin, the high humidity which had taken away my breath. Smell is the most evocative trigger, which can instantly carry us back even into early childhood memories. But such memories can also be triggered by any one or combination of the other modalities were present during their formation. How come? All the sensory impressions which reach our brain have a specific arousal pattern, which is related to the associative cortex. There, it activates already existing nerve cell couplings, which have been formed by earlier sensory impressions. If these impressions were very slightly, the superposition of both the old and the new arousal pattern will form a new, extended activation pattern, which correspond with a newly integrated experience. The more often the activation pattern is activated, the stronger it becomes. Cells that fire together, wire together, and if, as is usually the case, the activation pattern has been formed by a combination of different modalities, such as visual, auditory, olfactory, and tactile stimuli, the entire pattern may be reactivated and fire as a result of a single stimulus arriving in the brain. The more which modalities were involved when the pattern was formed, the more stable the memory, since it can be reactivated via several channels. This insight into the way we turn simultaneous multimodal stimuli into a coherent perception of gestalt by stabilizing them in the shape of coupled cells is a fairly recent one. It evolved from the early conditioning experiments by Ivan Pavlov. However, the conclusion we can now draw, namely that memories are laid down in a more stable way if a number of perception modalities are involved, was already known to Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, a German educationalist who proclaimed that children should learn with all their senses. Not only do Pestalozzi schools all over the world base their curriculum on this principle, but also other anthropological and holistic learning institutions. In the last chapter, we said that embodiment works because body posture is coupled with emotions, moods, and attitudes. Synchronous arousal patterns which manifest such entire perceptual gestalt composed of motoric, sensory, affective, and cognitive parts are known as distributed assemblies. If we are in the habit of meeting our friends every Saturday night at the beer garden, where we eat, drink, chat among linden trees, dance and listen to the local band, all these sensory inputs turn into perceptual gestalt, which on the neural level manifests itself as a synchronous arousal pattern. After a while, a single trigger, say a familiar piece of music or a scent of the linden trees, will suffice to stimulate the desire for a drink. This condition effect, which is caused by distributed assemblies firing synchronously, is the reason why addiction is so hard to overcome. However, there are also positive ways in which such trained collective firing can be applied, as when children are encouraged to learn with all senses. Not only does this enrich learning, make it more comprehensive, but it also facilitates memory retrieval, as there are several pathways which lead to the same arousal pattern. But how do we mold all these different sensory inputs into one meaningful experience in the first place? The binding problem of perception addresses the question of how we are capable of combining, within a window of approximately 100 to 200 milliseconds, such various features as color, texture, smell, and distance into the representation of an object. Although different neurons in separate parts of the cortex are involved in processing visual, auditory, or tactile stimuli which arrive at different speeds, the brain somehow managed to generate a coherent representation from these cross-modal stimuli. Until fairly recently, no convincing explanation could be given for what actually happens on the neural level when we form a gestalt. That is, a coherent representation of an object from a number of stimuli. One possible explanation proposed in the 80s is to be found in coupled gamma oscillations. Gamma waves have a frequency of typically 40 Hz and are ubiquitous in the human brain. When they phase lock, they trigger temporarily synchronous discharge in separate parts of the cortex. This model, known as binding by synchrony, is based on simultaneity, that is to say, on temporal congruence rather than spatial connections. In this model, convergence of connectivity is no longer the main variable of feature extraction. Rather, it's temporal synchrony of neurons representing the various attributes of objects that matter. The different stimulus features embedded in the activity of distributed cell assemblies can be brought together transiently by the temporal coherence of the activated neurons. German neuroscientist Wolf Singer suggests that this synchronization of neural oscillation is a necessary condition for consciousness. One candidate mechanism for the dynamic binding is the precise synchronization of neural responses that occurs when neural populations engage in well-synchronized oscillatory activity in the beta and gamma frequency range. These synchronized oscillations are strongly reduced or missing when the brain states are incompatible with conscious processing. As we have seen earlier, phase locking occurs in the external world between inside and outside, when human internal rhythms entrain to external ones, and within the body, for instance in the brain during an epileptic seizure. So how can we tell whether gamma synchronization is homemade or imported from the external world? Singer describes an experiment in which a synchronization in the visual cortex of cats correlated with perceptual grouping, that is to say, the recognition of a gestalt. Synchronization was found within and among different areas of the brain, as well as between hemispheres, proved to be genuinely homemade. Another cite from Singer: none of these synchronization phenomena were detectable by correlating successive recorded responses to the same stimuli, This indicates that the synchronization was not due to stimulus locking of responses, but to internal dynamic coordination of spiking times. An interesting observation in this context is the fact that stimulus-related synchronization is particularly strong when the global electroencephalography desynchronizes. That is to say, where there is more noise or disorder in the brain's dynamics, and when the individual, whether a person or an animal, is attentive. In fact, synchronization takes place even during the preparatory state of anticipating a task, which precedes the appearance of the stimulus and arouses attention. When cats were preparing themselves for a task and focused their attention, several cortical areas synchronized with zero phase lag. This synchronization increased immediately when the visual stimulus appeared and remained coordinated until the task was completed. After completion, synchronization disintegrated and was replaced by low-frequency oscillations, which did not phase lock. Singer correlates this anticipatory gamma activity with the reactivation of memory. He reports an experiment in which individuals had to recognize words, some of which they had registered, and semanticize consciously and unconsciously, just prior to and during the recognition of consciously perceived stimuli. Both theta and gamma activity occurred. To say about that? When unconsciously perceived stimuli were recognized, no coordinated oscillations were observed. This suggests that it is phase locking of oscillations which distinguish conscious from unconscious processing in the brain. Another side from Singer. About 180 milliseconds after presentation of stimuli that were consciously perceived, there was an epoch lasting around 100 milliseconds, during which induced gamma oscillations recorded from a larger number of regions exhibited precise phase locking both within and across hemispheres. Singer concludes that consciousness is not associated with activity in a particular region of the brain, but is an emergent phenomenon triggered by precise temporal coherence among distributed neural assemblies. Short windows of perfect synchrony could act as pace setters, which provide a common temporal reference frame into which events could be integrated. A promising candidate for such a time setter is the global theta oscillation, which sets in after events that trigger conscious processing. This would mean that, together with gamma and beta oscillation, a fractal clock ticks away in the brain. Another quote from Singer, apparently a very popular guy. ... Slow oscillations in the theta range have been found to be coupled by the coexistent beta and gamma oscillations. This suggests that the hypothesis that local coordination on computation within specific cortical areas is achieved by fast ticking clocks such as beta and gamma oscillations, while global and sustained integration of local results is achieved at a slower pace by low-frequency oscillations. The more global the representation, the longer is the time scale for integrated distributed information. It is perhaps more than a mere coincidence that the duration of subjective presence corresponds approximately to the cycle time of theta rhythms. The theta rhythms oscillated at 6 to 10 Hz and occur in humans during drowsy and meditative states. Singer also studied the connection between meditative states and the occurrence of synchronized gamma oscillations. In an experiment, he compared the synchronous activity in the brains of Tibetan monks, who had been in the habit of meditating for decades, with those of students who had never meditated before, and found a surprising level of activity in the left frontal cortex of the monks when they went into deep meditation. On the neural level, meditation correlated with synchronously culminating gamma frequencies. Singer calls the gamma frequency approximately 40 Hertz, the frequency of silence, because he believes that the synchronicity of gamma oscillations is triggered by the silence sought in meditation, when one attempts to rid oneself of all thoughts. The peaceful state of mind experienced in meditation, as well as the mental and physical feeling of being at one with oneself and with the world, can play a role in treatment of depression and pain. It does so in large number of medical institutions in the United States, which seek to influence the mood of patients so as to train them how to live with the chronic pain. This can be done by focusing on breathing or a mantra. The surprising extent of synchronous gamma oscillation, which were observed by Singer during meditation, is an example of internal entrainment as opposed to entrainment between human body and the environment. What happens during meditation is not nesting, although simultaneity is created. It is an exact looking in of oscillations, a congruent phase of neurons firing at the same time. Against the background of Singer's finding, it is necessary to distinguish between two kinds of simultaneity, namely nested and non-nested ones. Nested simultaneous events create a temporal perspective which spans several LODs, which generates depth. Entrainment, by contrast, creates a temporal perspective which is reduced to a few LODs, possibly only one, focusing on breathing or a mantra and eliminating all thoughts and successfully ignoring external stimuli. All these narrow our temporal perspective. To a degree, this is what happened to the law enforcement officer described in Chapter 1, who experienced a tunnel vision and reduced auditory perception. Mindfulness is another way of reaching this temporal perspective of reduced LODs. Instead of letting everyday actions run automatically, that is to say, allowing neural assemblies to fire together, focusing on individual aspects helps to resist hardwired responses and allows habitual patterns to be disentangled, both on the semantic and the neural level. However, this takes training and persistence. American neuroscientist Richard Davidson has shown that monks who had been in the habit of meditating for decades produced higher synchronicity in the brain than students who had been meditating only for a few months. So this temporal perspective of diminishing LODs can be trained. John Kabat-Zinn, the famous guy who more or less introduced mindfulness, remember him, has developed a method which is called mindfulness-based stress reduction. It is mainly used to treat chronic pain, stress, and the disorders accompanying cancer treatment. These findings support my suggestion that fractal and non-fractal observers perceive the world very differently. Fractal observers do so via a nested temporal interface, whereas non-fractal observers' event horizon is reduced to singly one LOD, generally displaying a high degree of fractality, that is to say, a high level of internal complexity is a sign of good health. However, the skill of reducing the degree of temporal fractality is also an advantage in dangerous situations, when we experience stress, and in meditation, when ideally we focus on one phenomena and resist all contextualizations. For the police officer, a narrow focus on essentials were vital. By blotting out all unnecessary perceptions, he was able to devote his full attention to the shootout. By humming a mantra or concentrating on breathing, an individual engaged in meditation will, ideally, enter a state in which it is possible to resist all contextualization and avoid disturbing influences. Synchronization is one way of explaining the binding problem. However, the question remains as to what happens before synchronization. How do we merge into one meaningful event those Chris model stimuli which take different amounts of time to reach our body and our brains? The simultaneity created by entrainment is not the same as that generated by temporally nested events. Entrainment leads to a reduction of LODs because all oscillations are congruent in time. In other words, although the oscillations may occur in different neural assemblies, they are temporally on one LOD. Nested events, on the other hand, cannot be reduced to one LOD because they overlap, unless the case that they are perfectly self-similar. See chapter 10. In terms of fractal time, we may say that during entrainment, when we observe total congruence, delta T depth approaches 0, whereas in the processing of nested events, retains the number of LODs of the overlapping stimuli. Delta T depth remains stable. Nevertheless, all these LODs are moduled into one event. How come? David Eagleman suggests that we coordinate the stimuli which arrive via our various senses, vision, hearing, touch, smell, etc. By creating a time window within which we mold them into one event. Our brain makes up for speed disparities both between and within sensory channels. Within the visual system, for instance, by integrating color, motion, and spatial perspective into one object. He believes that our brain manages this integrative task by waiting for the slowest information to arrive. This time window happens to extend to about 1/10 of a second, more by Singer. In the early days of television broadcasting, engineers worried about the problem of keeping audio and video signals synchronized, when they accidentally discovered that they had around 100 milliseconds of a slope. As long as the signals arrived within these windows, viewers' brains would automatically resynchronize the signals. Outside the 1/10 of a second window, it suddenly looked like a badly dubbed movie. Apparently, our visual system makes up for the delays. This means, of course, that our perception of the events do not occur in real time. We perceive an event which happened in the past. Eagleman thus concludes that awareness is post-dictive. We integrate visual stimuli within a window of a tenth of a second, and in retrospect make sense of them. For other senses, such as hearing or touch, the window may have a slightly different extension, but the underlying molding mechanism is the same. Even within one modality, delay times are readily compensated by our brain. More from Singer. If you touch your toe and your nose at the same time, you will feel those touches as simultaneous. This is surprising because the signal from your nose reaches your brain well before the signal from your toe. It seems that within a time window, our brain combines information into one unified perception of the world, which is formed in retrospect. As Eagleman points out, given conduction times along the limbs, this leads to the bizarre but testable suggestion that tall people may live further in the past than short people. I don't know why that's funny. He compares perception with the airing of a live television show. We do not make sense of the world in real time, but in retrospect. After a short delay which allows us to perform corrections of editing, if editing should be necessary to generate and maintain a non-contradictory world. This time delay, which results from our brain waiting for the slowest modality, is another factor to be considered in the binding problem. To this can be added the fact that our brain collects and merges perceptions from different senses at different speeds. But how come our brain seems to know what happens simultaneously in the external world? Eagleman himself provides a convincing answer. Our brain constantly recalibrates our expectation about arrival times, and the best way of anticipating the relative timing of incoming stimuli is to interact with the world. Whenever you touch or bump into something, our brains assume that all visual, auditory and tactile inputs we perceive within the small window of time are simultaneous. Thus, Eagleman's hypothesis shed new lights on NOE's, N-O-E with a tremor, conclusion that perception is action. We saw in chapter 4 that being used to delay times make us highly vulnerable to distortion of temporal order when, for instance, a delay we have grown accustomed to is suddenly removed. Taking away the expected delay fools our brains into an illusionary reversal of time, as happened in the example of the press key, which is followed after a short delay by a flash. Removing the delay makes us see the flash before the key press. Anticipation is a powerful corrective and vital to assignment of causality. Did I first hit the key, or did the light flash before I pressed the button? To maintain a calibration which generates a non-contradictory world for us, it is necessary to continuously interact with our environment, which includes other people. And I think that is most important. Without the interaction on other people, we will lose the skill of simultaneity. I start to understand more and more that simultaneity is a skill, and that skill is incredibly important for instance, coordination within the body, but also coordination or adaptation to the environment. And how skillfully we move and how good we are at that is based on how developed is our simultaneity. And once more, there's one more of these things that we assume to be absolutely passive turns out to be something completely active and extremely different from person to person, and also different from race to race and culture to culture. It's depending on the training, not so much depending on what you're born with, but your attitude to the world. If you see your world as something you actively engaged with, that world will be different, and not as passive and, how can you say, out there and non-relative. But once you're engaged in it, it becomes absolutely different. Not as strong, and you will interact with it instead of just looking at it. It's going from the interactive procedure where you develop your activation skills, you develop simultaneity, and you don't think it's somewhere outside of your own control, because that would be absolutely terrible. It is like putting on slalom cross-country skiing and say, the skis tell me how to ski and I don't have to do anything. It's disastrous. And we had this disastrous development for a long time in the West. I think Susie Vrobel is a real evangelium to showing us way back to action once more. And that we even today come as far as we regard mental things to be absolutely passive. A little bit like Descartes thought that his whole thinking was out of his own control, which is absolutely limiting to everything. There is no progress possible. It is just on the sloppy slope to nowhere. Susie Vrobel shows, now we found a way. Now we know that activation is the truth. And we also know that a healthy system is fractally complex. And that will only develop by training. Nothing else would give that fractal complexity. And that also means a healthy mind in a healthy body, to sort of rephrase Aristotle from southern London. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.